I know it was passed in order to stop a lot of incredible burdens that were being put on folks and stopping people from voting in the South, but all around the country too.
The idea that people of color, because that's typically who it was geared towards, would have to prove their sort of their right to vote, which was sort of invalidating their citizenship.
I think you should be able to register to vote and not show ID at the polls. We don't want to do anything that's going to make it harder for people to vote. Not enough people vote right now.
The Voting Rights Act was under attack, has been under attack, and continues to be under attack, not only in various southern states, but various states that have Republican legislatures and governors who want to do away with the voting rights and privileges of minority people.
Certain states had to get congressional approval before they changed their laws, and now they can just do kind of whatever they want. It was like specific to a lot of states that had had problems before.
I would suggest that it does need to be reviewed to ensure that nobody's disenfranchised, but you also have to be careful about how that power is consolidated and who's in charge of that.
I come from a state where we have same-day registration, and that's a real good system they should have nationwide.
Okay, and where are you from, sir?
Iowa.
You know, you're hearing about all of these different issues that people have with something that should be a right in a democracy to just show up and vote. So, but I live in D.C., so I don't get to vote often anyways.
In a recent letter to the New York Times, President Barack Obama says he would not be where he is today had it not been for the unsung heroes who are still fighting to make voting easier for people of color to vote. He again urged Congress to restore all parts of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Since Obama became president, voting rights for many Americans are under attack. About a dozen states are now clamping down on who is allowed to cast a ballot. Opponents argue that these laws are racist and prevent minorities from exercising their right to vote. Now, we're talking measures that include showing a photo ID, purging voter rolls, the end to early voting, and for many Latinos, having to show the proper papers. Now, of course, there's always the politics. Democrats argue that this is a shady attempt by the GOP to swing elections. Not so, say Republicans firing back that they're just trying to prevent voter fraud. Well, then in 2013, things really got complicated. That's when the Supreme Court killed a major part of the Voting Rights Act. That ruling and the timing of it, just 2 years shy of its 50th anniversary, was a huge wake-up call that the fight for voter rights is far from over. Now states with a bad history of voter discrimination no longer have to obtain pre-clearance from the federal government to make changes to their voting practices. So, is this all about race, politics, or both? Is the Voting Rights Act now on life support? And what type of protests could this set off at a time when race relations in this country are already volatile? Well, pull up a seat because we're about to break it all down up next on Vocal Point. And welcome. I'm Anqoinette Crosby. Joining me today to talk about voting rights is Lorenzo Morris. He is the chair of the Political Science Department at Howard University. Catherine Culleton Gonzalez. She is the senior attorney and director of voter protection for the Advancement Project. Raynard Jackson is a Republican strategist and runs his own consulting firm. Barbara Arnwine is the former president of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and she is also the host of her own radio show. And later on, we'll hear from Kimberly Perry, the executive director of DC Vote. Welcome to all of you. Now, before we get into the thick of things, let's take a look back on why this country needed a Voting Rights Act in the first place.
After the Civil War, the 15th Amendment guaranteed African American men the right to vote. But to keep them from casting their ballots, Southern states for decades employed discriminatory tactics like the poll tax and literacy tests. African Americans who tried to register faced job loss, intimidation, and violence. Some paid the ultimate sacrifice. During the 1950s and 1960s, African Americans were fed up with second-class citizenship. They demanded their right to vote and began to protest for due process. On March 7, 1965, an event took place that would change the face of the civil and voter rights movement. Some 600 peaceful demonstrators gathered in Selma, Alabama, to march to the state capitol. The march was organized by the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. When marchers reached the Edmund Pettus Bridge, state troopers were waiting and blocked their crossing. The officers demanded the marchers turn back, and when they refused, the troopers drove them back with nightsticks and tear gas. More than 50 protesters were wounded, a third hospitalized. This episode, which became known as Bloody Sunday, was broadcast on television for all to see. The treatment of the protesters outraged many, not just in the U.S., but around the world. In the aftermath of Bloody Sunday, a second march was attempted, but it wasn't until a third try that the protesters made it all the way to Montgomery. With Reverend Martin Luther King leading the way, thousands of supporters arrived on Montgomery's state capitol steps. It was March 25, 1965, just 2 weeks after Bloody Sunday. There, King delivered his famous "How long, not long" speech. He said, quote, "I know you are asking today, how long will it take? I come to say to you this afternoon, however difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long." His words proved prophetic. The marches had a powerful effect on Washington. President Johnson made a speech to Congress calling for voting rights legislation. He pointed out the ways in which African Americans were denied the right to vote by election officials in the South. After much debate, the Voting Rights Act was passed by Congress and signed into law by the President on August 6, 1965. It ensured that African Americans and other minorities had the right to vote. And it meant, for the first time, voter discrimination could be legally challenged. The Voting Rights Act is considered one of the most important civil rights legislation of all time. But where does it stand now? In recent years, states across the country have passed measures which appear to make it harder for minorities, the elderly, students, and people with disabilities to exercise their fundamental right to vote. These measures include cuts to early voting, voter ID laws, and voter roll purchase. So today, some are still asking, how long? And will the answer be as hopeful as it was when delivered on the Capitol steps in Montgomery 50 years ago?
However difficult the moment, however frustrating the hour, it will not be long, because truth crushed earth will rise again.
What a powerful, powerful speech. So Barbara, we've just witnessed how long the struggle took to get the Voting Rights Act passed. Bring us up to speed as to what are the challenges today.
It's really rather horrific when you think about it, when you think about all the blood sacrifice and all of the marchers and all of the fights in Congress, all the litigation that here in 2015, as we sit here, we have states that have passed so many repressive voting registration laws, voter ID laws, come up with restrictions on early voting, doing all these things that sound a lot like the old school poll taxes, sound like when they're talking about citizenship papers, like grandfather clauses. I mean, there's all these restrictions that are happening. As we sit here today, 133 pieces of voter repressive legislation is pending in the states across the United States.
So let's talk about specifically where are those hot spots?
They're all over, unfortunately. One of the hottest spots right now, of course, is North Carolina, where there's the monster bill that changed and reversed everything by eliminating same-day registration during early voting, cut the days of early voting down, got rid of what you call soda to polls Sundays, where the churches used to take African Americans and Latinos out to make sure that they would vote, to give them that assistance. It also, came up with voter ID laws and all kind of precinct changes, a whole lot of really drastically repressive and ugly measures. So that case just started last week in the courts. Isn't that ironic? The same week as we're talking about the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, you have this massive case that the Advancement Project and others have been leading, so I'm sure you'll hear a lot more about that. But also, we just won a big victory last week in the Fifth Circuit, because Texas had passed, and Texas has been horrible, and everybody's been talking about this terrible, onerous voter ID law, where you can use a handgun permit, but you cannot use your student identification issued by the state university. You can't use your your own employee identification issued by the state government.
What's the reasoning, do you think, is behind all of that?
Well, in Texas, 700,000 people lack the ID that they're talking about. Think about that, changes the entire political dynamic in that state. In South Carolina, where we sued, 350,000 people lack that ID. People talk about the Charleston 9, the people who were massacred by the white supremacist Mr. Roth. They don't talk about the fact that the last vote that Mr. Pinckney cast was to try to change the voter ID law in the state of South Carolina. So these laws have real impact on people, and people want to say, well, it's just theoretical, but let me tell you, in 2014, I was at the hotline, the national hotline that Election Protection runs, and people were calling 1-866-OUR-VOTE, and they were saying, I can't vote in Texas. They're telling me I gotta cast a provisional ballot that won't be counted.
Okay. Rainer, let's bring you into the mix here. As a Republican strategist, what is the strategy behind allowing gun IDs if you own a gun, but you cannot vote if you obtain a student ID?
Well, first we got to add some context to the conversation. Number one, there is no move to voter suppression. Number one, that's so idiotic. That doesn't pass the smell test, number one. Number two, the Supreme Court did not repeal, alter, or change the Voting Rights Act when they made their decision a couple years ago, Section 5. All the Supreme Court said and did was, you have a polyester suit on. We want you to put a more up-to-date suit on. That you wanted to break it down so Pookie and them can understand it. That's what the Supreme Court said. And what the Democrats have done, they've been masterful at creating a political issue because they don't have a legal issue. And so what's amazing is you take Georgia.
We don't have a legal issue, but we won.
Well, but what's interesting? No. But I think that Texas thing with Rick Perry, and I've known Rick Perry for 25 years. No, it was stupid. If you accept a NRA ID card and not I disagree with that. Where Republicans have missed the mark is they, number one, should never ever alter election laws during an election cycle. Okay. Always do it during an off cycle period. That way you take politics off the table. That's the first thing. But it's amazing, Georgia and Indiana in 2005 passed some of the most restrictive voter ID laws in the country. You know what? Obama won Indiana the first time a Democrat had won in over 40 years, number one. Then Georgia, voter turnout in Georgia in 2008, after this repressive, supposedly ID law, it went off the charts in the black community. Voter turnout was up. So if this is voter suppression, how do you account for blacks for the first time in the history of the country in 2012 outnumber white folks as far as going to the poll?
Barbara's got an answer.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that's crazy where you flip the people's concerns. Let me tell you, When people went and stood out in those lines for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 hours in Florida and hours in North Carolina, I stood out in my line in Maryland for 3 hours. When people did that, it wasn't because all of a sudden blacks had more power politically than whites. It had to do with the fact that we were so concerned about all these repressive measures that we said we're going to make sure that we vote, we're going to early vote, we're going to do everything in our power. And because we were vigilant and determined, all of a sudden people are saying, well, that means you're equal.
No, you just undercut your own argument. If voter turnout is up, it can't be voter suppression by definition.
Of course it is.
You can't have it both ways.
Of course it is. I mean, we marched. Are you going to say that just because people were marching, that suddenly made them equal and better? People march, people fight, people go to those polls, people do everything they can to turn out because they want to beat the effects of voter suppression. In Florida, the reason why people had to stand in lines for 10 hours because they couldn't go to the polls as they used to do the early vote because they cut the hours. They took away the Sunday voting. They took away everything that people relied on. The fact that we're determined to overcome obstacles.
But we outnumber white folks for the first time in the history of the country.
Because
well, they didn't outnumber them.
We just voted.
Hold on. Lorenzo, go ahead.
We just voted more. Go ahead.
Voter suppression can be ineffective at times because of huge minority efforts. But let's face it, the turnout in 2008, like the turnout in so many times in black communities, even at other periods, at local elections, you had 80 and 85% black turnout in local elections when the stress of the commitment and the stress of the resistance may have been great. That doesn't change the suppression. 5% would normally change most elections in American history, and so suppression only has to get those. And
but
when
show
that
me,
occurs, I'm going to agree with you on something.
Hold up.
I'm going to agree with you on something. The Supreme Court that rejected elements of the Voting Rights Act was not the issue of the Republican Party that approved the Voting Rights Act years ago. This is a whole new group. This is I call it an insurgent group within the Republican Party that has taken over. You had Justice Scalia saying that the Voting Rights Act was a kind of racial entitlement. And I like that expression only because it fits your little image of the polyester suit. They didn't look behind the polyester suit to see that there was a good man in it and a good item in it. The structure of Section 4, which imposed Voting Rights Act, that is the Supreme Court looked at the part of the act that said this Section 5, which calls for preclearance, would be applicable, and said, well, the section just said if a certain number of people hadn't registered, then they would be subject to the Voting Rights Act, and that's arbitrary. But in point of fact, in a real democracy, if you have less than 50% of the people registered, you have an ineffective democracy and one that will not be stable.
But why did Congress
wait a minute.
No.
They did it under the emphasis on prior discrimination. It just so happened that the polyester suit was a good suit in terms of the structure.
And Raynard, how about if you can't afford the polyester suit? Right. What happens
No. The Supreme Court was saying Congress needed to update the formula.
They did.
Because what they did, they took the 64, 68, and 72 elections and use that as the basis for the formula.
No.
Supreme Court
The formula
You
simply
need to
uses that as
read
evidence of the
You need to
formula.
read
Those
the
elections
law.
you provide evidence to reaffirm the formula. The problem is it was good politics to find a uniform rule. The court was obsessed by the fact that because they had found discrimination, they had no way of putting it into the law, in full knowledge of the fact that putting it into the law in a direct accusatory way would be something that would be impossible to get through the Congress.
Let's bring Kathy in. Kathy, what are you seeing as an attorney, and also you're fighting for the voting rights of Latinos? What are some of the things that you're experiencing?
Well, actually, taking away the preclearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act is exactly as Justice Ginsburg said. She said, taking it away is like putting down your umbrella when you're in the middle of a rainstorm. So since the Shelby decision in 2013, we have seen a deluge of voter suppression laws in the formerly covered jurisdictions, which are the Deep South, which is a place that has not completely changed. We've seen in Texas and North Carolina, in Virginia and Mississippi and Alabama, all kinds of laws that are suppressive because they have a discriminatory impact and effect on voters of color, on African Americans, and on Latinos. And so we've seen a concerted effort to push back against the changing demographics of our country and to discriminate in voting against those very groups, which we've proven again over and over in court and intend to keep doing so.
We've heard a lot about Shelby v. Holder. Describe what is going on there.
Well, Shelby versus Holder is a decision of the Supreme Court from June of 2013. that basically held that one provision of the Voting Rights Act, Section 4B, that told who should be covered by the provisions of Section 5, which is the preclearance provision. It set forth the formula of which states and which jurisdictions should be covered. Let's be very clear, 12,000 jurisdictions were covered by the Section 4B formula.
And these are jurisdictions that have had a history of bad behavior.
And continuing practices of bad behavior. And that's what I found the worst about the Shelby decision, was that here's a decision that is decided in 2013. This is 2.5 years after some of the worst voter repression laws in this country, and not one sentence of that decision mentions one of those laws. So when they're talking about it was about trying to update and be current, no. This is a decision written by Chief Justice Roberts, who years before, decades before, has said that his #1 goal
when he was a clerk, right?
Right, was to strike down and invalidate the Voting Rights Act. And so we got to be very clear that this was not, some kind of judicial proceeding. The other thing I want to be very clear about is that people keep saying, well, these laws don't have any effect, there's no evidence. There is, in fact, a new study out looking at the election of 2014 that talks about the impact of voter suppression laws on the vote, and showing that it actually hurt voters in many states and had the effect of really suppressing probably 5% of the electorate.
Rainer, I promise I'm going to let you get in, because I know you want to talk about voter suppression that it doesn't even exist, so hold on. Well, when we return, we'll look at how this could have a huge impact on the 2016 elections. But first, the NAACP recently kicked off its America's Journey for Justice March, and the right to vote was front and center.
Earlier this month, the NAACP kicked off America's Journey for Justice, marching across the South to the steps of the nation's capital to save lives, for more jobs, for better schools, and for the protected right to vote.
We march because our lives matter, our votes matter, our jobs matter, our schools matter.
The march was organized to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The walkers are a little more than a quarter of the way through an 860-mile journey, or as the organizers have said, 1.7 million steps toward justice.
What is our mission? We are NAACP soldiers. We must be focused, determined, educated, strong, unafraid to stand up against the masses and be a voice for the few. We are confident in justice. We are catalysts for radical positive change. We step with boldness to the battlefield now, because tomorrow is never promised to a warrior. We are NAACP soldiers.
Well, we can see that folks are really passionate about these issues. So let's talk about how these voter ID laws and other tactics impact the 2016 elections. Now, Raynard, there's been some talk by the GOP that they want to become a more inclusive party. How's that been working for y'all?
Good, but before I give that, let me read something to you.
All right.
This is the North Carolina case, the voter ID. And it's amazing that...
Shelby?
No. This had nothing to do with Shelby. The
What
voter
is this?
ID law, you know about that, Barbara. In North Carolina, which is supposed to have one of the most restrictive voter ID laws in the country,
Okay.
but yet voter turnout in North Carolina during the 2014 congressional was one of the few states in the whole country where voter turnout was up, off the Richter scale. So if there is this notion of voter suppression, the numbers, and again, at some point we got to get to the numbers, but let me read you what the Justice Department, this is what the U.S. Department of Justice filed in a brief to the North Carolina case when they sued them.
Let's
Here
hear
is
it.
the actual quote about black folks. Black voters were less sophisticated voters, and it's less likely to imagine these voters can figure out how to avail themselves of registering and voting. In other words, the U.S. Justice Department, in a brief, filed that black folks are stupid. They don't know how to figure out what the laws of voting in North Carolina.
Lord.
That's actually a brief.
Kathy, you're shaking your head.
No, I just want to say, I mean, that's taken completely out of context. And the truth is that the voter ID law has not yet been implemented in North Carolina, so it has nothing to do with
yes, it
has not yet been implemented in North Carolina. It is the subject of litigation. It's the subject of litigation by Advancement Project on behalf of the North Carolina NAACP and Ms. Rosanelle Eaton, who's 94 years old, and a number of individual Black and Latino
you all
voters.
are pimping that woman.
And so,
it is crazy.
So the truth is that how people react to voter suppression doesn't necessarily mean there isn't voter suppression.
Show me where the suppression is, though. That's what you're losing.
You want to see it takes more effort and more burden for people of color to be able to
show
vote.
a driver's license. Really?
Hold up.
That is correct because of the socioeconomic disparities, because of the history of discrimination in North Carolina.
Really?
We have actually shown that many of these laws are intentionally discriminatory too. They're surgically, precisely cutting back on the rising American electorate of African Americans and Latinos. 70% of African Americans use early voting. Why do you think that was cut?
Kathy, let's hold on just a second. We've been talking a lot about the Black vote. Obviously, you working with Latinos. What are some of the struggles that they've had to overcome?
Well, in North Carolina and in other states, these voter suppression laws hit the Latino community as well. So there's less access to driver's licenses, transportation, information. There's not a lot of information in Spanish about voting.
And also is there right to have bilingual poll workers, is that correct? And the ballots.
Yes, in many jurisdictions there is that right, because to have to vote in your second language is a form of literacy test. So, for example, Puerto Ricans, U.S. citizens by birthright, have grown up in an education system that's centered on Spanish, and they have no reason to have to learn English to be a U.S. citizen. The other thing is that many of these voter ID laws, or the new limits on registration, where people have to show documentary proof of citizenship, are very hard on the African American community because of the lack of access to birth certificates. And for the Latino community, if you need to get another copy of your naturalization papers, at minimum it's $345.
And you have some of the paperwork there that you can kind of show us what they have to go through, is that right?
I do. This is from the USCIS website, and in order to get a replacement naturalization certificate, the statutory filing fee is $345. There's no exceptions. And if you were born overseas to U.S. To U.S. citizens, and so folks who are living overseas in France or whatever, if you were to have children overseas, in order to get that proof of citizenship, $600.
Okay. Lorenzo, I want to ask you, because Raynard, you didn't answer the question, but I'll come back to you. If the GOP is talking about being more inclusive, do they need the Latino vote in order to win 2016?
The failure to be inclusive has turned the Latino vote, if it wasn't already Democratic, heavily Democratic. As a matter of fact, in the last election, we saw a huge leap in Democratic voting among Asian voters. In other words, minorities that are vulnerable to possible discrimination felt sensitively the structure of both campaigning and of the anti-voting rights activity. Remember, in places like Pennsylvania, the leader of the majority party in the state legislature bragged that voting restrictions would deliver the election to Romney. So it's a very partisan and politically sensitive activity, and to not take a strong stand for it is to make minorities feel vulnerable to those people who seem to be indifferent, much less opposed to it. So that it is essential to the Republican Party, if it's going to claim to recruit minorities, to show a visible interest in mobilizing around their possibility of what is basic democratic participation.
So, Raynard, as a strategist, what type of consultation are you giving party leaders in order to be more inclusive? Do you honestly believe that some of these tactics, some of these measures are what is needed in order to bring in people of color, or are you going to see a backlash?
Well, no, number one, there's no backlash. Number two, where the Republican Party is deficient is they have allowed the Democrats to just be masterful and using these buzzwords, voter suppression, which there's none of it, ballot access denial, and all this crazy stuff. Republicans are horrible dealing with anything with a racial tinge. The issue with the Hispanic and to a lesser extent the Asian community, the reason they are so in bed with the Democrats has nothing to do with philosophy, more so they tend to lean more on government services than other demographic groups. So it's more of a self-preservation issue. So what Republicans are doing, they're spending more time talking about entrepreneurship, education, because under Obama, he has devastated the HBCU community, and Howard is a living example of some of the negative impact of the policies coming out of the Department of Education. And so Republicans are dealing with entrepreneurship education, but they have to do a better job communicating.
So you're
with Black
saying
and
they're a
Hispanic.
party that's more empowering to people of color?
Yes, no question, no question.
And apparently, you know, people of color just vote against our best interests, right?
Yeah, you do that every day.
No.
Every day.
You know, let's talk about some other stuff. You know, we've been talking about voter suppression from the state level, but what we didn't talk about also is what I call deceptive practices and voter intimidation. In North Carolina in 2012, and in the state of Virginia in 2012, there were people who made calls to people's homes and said, oh, you're a great Democratic voter. You've done such a great job. You come to every poll. You know, you've always voted for the primaries, etc. And so because you're such a great voter, we want you to know that you can vote by telephone. You can vote by phone. They did this in the Black community.
Wait, who is they? Who is they?
Hold on. They did this in the Black community, and it was so bad that the Secretary of State Board of Elections in North Carolina had to go on television and tell people, no, you cannot vote by phone. That is a deceptive practice.
But who is
And
they?
that's a good question.
And
Who are they?
We have actually traced back some of these deceptive practices that have been, you know, go on telling people that, you know, Democrats vote on Wednesdays, Republicans on Tuesdays, all this nonsense that people say, you know, that you're going to be arrested if you go to the polls and you haven't paid your utility bills, your child support, or your traffic tickets, all this nonsense, that you're going to lose custody of your children. We have traced some of those calls back, and sadly, in a couple of instances, and I say sadly because this really shouldn't be, they have in fact been party operatives.
Okay, well, Lorenzo, so back in the late 1800s, blacks were predominantly Republicans.
Yeah.
And there were some tactics by Democrats, violence,
Yes.
you name it. So really, doesn't this come down to not so much race, but just who wants to win at all costs?
Well, race can be a part of your wanting to win at all costs, certainly.
But it can be with either party, though.
Not automatically. One has a commitment. The Republicans were protective of African Americans to a large extent because they needed them, but also because the Democratic Party had been the party of the Confederacy. When things changed, it was when the Democratic Party began to come around in the 30s under the New Deal with an openness. And also, coincidentally, at the same time the Democratic Party was liberalizing and expanding, and the Republican Party then was more moderate, was at the time that blacks began to have progress in the courts. They went together. And even today, if you look at the Republican, just take a look at the Republican Party on stage the other week when everybody was amused. That is indirectly linked to the suppression of black votes, the gerrymandering that has been historic, has helped to create rigidly, ideologically formed parties. Gerrymandering is racially illegal, but you can do it under a party structure. And that creates a kind of tendency within the Republican Party to be as rigid, so that even moderate Republicans looked on the stage and said, oh my God, but they didn't know the reason.
Let me give your audience a little history lesson, because I was directly involved in this. 1991, after the 1990 census, the Republican Party, and we filed an amicus brief with the NAACP to the Department of Justice.
NAACP?
Yes. And here's the deal we cut. The Democrats and the Congressional Black Caucus, there's very few members then, they wanted to have more black representation in the House of Representatives. So the deal was cut that we will give you minority set-aside district in exchange for giving districts that are more Republican-oriented. And that's what happened. And that's why Republicans took over the House in 1994. A direct result of that 91 deal.
Can I just say,
Kathy?
I'm a former Department of Justice voting section attorney, and we do not cut deals. We enforce the law.
Get out
We
of
do
here.
not cut
Right,
deals.
hold on.
We
Right.
enforce the law to equal access to the ballot. This is much more about race than party politics. But I will say that the Republican Party platform includes strict voter ID laws, proof of citizenship, using databases that are faulty, and all of these things that have a disparate impact.
But
on people
elections
of
are run
color.
on the state level, not the federal level, so I'm confused at that state.
national
No, no, no,
platform
no,
adopted in
We're throwing
2012.
around a lot of terms, and we really
Yes.
want to
Right.
let folks know exactly what
Yes.
some of these terms mean, if not, if everyone doesn't know. So gerrymandering, who wants to take that?
I think I was.
Okay.
Very briefly, it's restructuring districts for political purposes, and it's illegal when it's done for racial purposes. So in 1960, there was a famous case in Alabama and Tuskegee in which they gerrymandered, meaning the state legislature restructured a city, to exclude all blacks from the city, even though the city was majority black. But when you looked at the actual voting, the district went around people's houses.
Let's move on to voter purging.
I can take that
one.
So voter purging is when you take the voting rolls and you compare them to other lists and sometimes purge or cage or try to identify people who are allegedly non-citizens or allegedly don't belong on the voting rolls or allegedly have moved. And oftentimes these databases have completely incorrect data and voters are dropped from the rolls and unable to vote.
Okay, last one, poll tax.
Poll tax is any kind of payment that you must make in order to either have access to the polls or to actually vote. So for many years, it was required in many of the southern states that in order for you to vote that you had to pay a poll tax. And you could not vote otherwise. And we're saying that some of the modern day measures such as voter ID, where it requires that in order for you to get the identification that the state requires, that you must have a birth certificate and you have to pay, $45 or whatever, go online to get the birth certificate, that is a modern day poll tax.
Okay, I did say last one, but last one, felony disenfranchisement.
Oh, that is vicious.
It is.
That is because of the unjust nature of over-incarceration of people of color in this society, that felons, what happens is that there are 35 states that say that you cannot vote even after you serve your time and you've gotten out of jail unless you have completed parole or probation. There's another 8 states that say that you have to complete parole, you got to complete probation, and you have to wait 5 years. Then there's other states like Iowa, Kentucky, good old Virginia's kind of changing, that basically say that you have to, in order to, that you cannot vote, that you're banned from voting unless you're pardoned by the governor.
Great definition. So most of us take it for granted that we have representatives in Congress who will fight for our best interests. Well, that's not the case if you live in the District of Columbia. Many have been battling for years to change this. That includes the district's non-voting delegate, Eleanor Holmes Norton.
If, in fact, the District of Columbia was a largely Republican city, these members would be on the floor arguing for voting rights for the District of Columbia, just as the radical Republican abolitionists gave us the vote, which was then taken from us and gave us home rule. I will not yield, sir. The District of Columbia has spent 206 years yielding to people who would deny them the vote. I yield you no ground. Not during my time. You have had your say, and your say has been that you think that the people who live in your capital are not entitled to a vote in their house. Shame on you.
Well, many people that we spoke to on the streets of the nation's capital felt just as strongly.
Well, no taxation without representation, certainly.
We should have a voting representative, not only in the House of Representatives, but also in the United States Senate.
You've got people living here just like they do in any other state in the country that need to be represented fully and taken into account. And so anytime that doesn't happen, I think that's a bad thing.
We can vote for something that, 70% of residents want, but Congress can come in, say no, but we didn't vote for that Congress.
Obviously, it's a major population center. There's no good reason not to give voting rights to people who live in D.C., and I think it makes a lot of sense. I don't really understand the argument against it other than pure history.
The District of Columbia being predominantly Democratic, nobody wants, the Republican Congress does not want an additional 2 Democratic votes on their floor.
It makes you feel really disenfranchised and like you don't matter just because you chose to live in the capital.
It would enable residents of the District of Columbia, particularly those of us in the military, who risk our lives for voting rights and enfranchisement for people in the United States and around the world, to be able to have a benefit that we do not have in the District of Columbia at the federal level.
I do believe, as a taxpayer of any taxpayer of Washington, D.C., you should not have to forfeit your rights because of your zip code.
Kimberly, let's get an update on where things stand. So do you see a parallel between DC's fight for the right for their voting rights and what's going on nationally?
There's an interesting parallel here, unfortunately. I mean, as all of the celebrations and reflections of the 50th anniversary of not only the March on Washington, but the Voting Rights Act, we have to constantly remind people that there are still 5 million disenfranchised American citizens here in the United States. Many of them live in the U.S. territories, and nearly 1 million of them live right here in the nation's capital. We have been fighting for more than 200 years for voting rights, and I want to be clear, we haven't been fighting just for a vote. We want full representation, full democratic equality, and that means proper representation in the House of Representatives, a voting member of the House, and 2 senators. That is what we deserve. That is what the movement and the struggle's been all about. And it hasn't been more than 200 years of nothing. People have been fighting over time. We won the 23rd Amendment in 1961 to be able to vote for president and for vice president. Lots of lives were lost, blood shed. We continued that fight 10 years later to get the Delegate Act. So we do have a delegate to the House, non-voting of course, and then home rule came shortly after that. And so now we've just got to finish this fight and make it to the finish line.
Why has it not happened, do you think?
Several reasons, but look, I think it was probably mentioned up here already. Politics is a huge part of it. The District of Columbia has more than 80% registered Democrats. The Republican Party would not like to see 3 additional Democratic seats in the Congress, and so that is a huge barrier to suppressing the voice of DC residents. Over time, it's been an array of reasons from race, income inequality, and so on, but now as it stands, this is a power battle in the Congress over partisan politics.
But hasn't there been a time when in Congress, the Democrats being in control, that this could have happened, and why didn't it happen then?
And for various reasons, the racial dynamics that were just discussed, the change from loyalty of African Americans and other people of color to the Democratic Party from the Republican Party are part of that. The changing demographics in the city have changed over time. I remember first moving to the District of Columbia, we were about 70% African American. It's now 49% African American. So the city is changing rapidly, racial demographics as well as, and probably more importantly, economic changes in the status of its residents.
Rainer, let's get you in here. Got any thoughts on this?
I'm the biggest introvert on the panel, but I'm gonna force myself to say something.
Go ahead.
You alluded to something, and Kimberly, I'd love to get you to address this more directly. When Bill Clinton was president in his first 2 years, similarly, President Obama in his first 2 years, you all had a veto-proof Congress. Democrats controlled the House and the Senate, and neither Bill Clinton nor Barack Obama lifted a finger. They could have snapped their finger. D.C. would have had statehood with these 2 Democratic presidents. They didn't do it. So I want to hear you call them racist.
Here's what I will say.
Okay, I rest my case.
Yeah, this is easy. We've got to move forward. Folks have been fighting for decades in the past. We can sort of
are they
analyze.
Racist? They called the Republican Party racist for, you say, blocking it, but didn't Obama and Bill Clinton block it also?
Here's what we know, is we've got to be on a track to change people's hearts and minds around this country, no matter the political status, right? There are questions about the validity of voting rights. 1 vote in the House, that would be questionable. Is that constitutional? Looking at statehood as an option. Do you shrink the federal district and create a new state with DC's 120 neighborhoods? The Constitution can guarantee full voting rights for people who live in a state. So that is why people are so tied to the statehood movement. There are also people who understand and are wed to full voting rights, equal voting rights. The point is, we deserve the same democratic equality that every other American citizen in this country enjoys and often takes for granted. Although with all that's happening, we know a lot of people are not taking them for granted. So this is more about a movement. This is more about going outside the lines of the District of Columbia. This is about educating people across the country that their sisters and brothers, their friends and relatives, the affinities they have to the nation's capital, the people here are not free. We live under a colonial system where Congress controls not only our vote and our voice, but our budget, our local tax dollars, and every single law that we pass to take care of and address the needs of our citizens. Congress has control of that. They interfere. They are more wed to their own political agenda than the people who live here. That is not acceptable. It's un-American, it's undemocratic, and it's got to change, and it will change.
Okay, well, the fight continues. Well, let's get to some of our social media questions. We tweeted, do recent changes to the Voting Rights Act concern you? Well, we heard back from Newsgirl03, and she says it remains the same fight. The social fabric of the country is still ripped with discrimination. Now, you can keep the conversation going by tweeting us at #Don'tMessWithMyVote and #VocalPointWHUT. Now we're ready to get our studio audience involved. Now, who has the first question? Hi, step up to the mic, give us your name and just your affiliation would be great.
Hi, my name is Laura Williamson, and thank you all for being here tonight. I work with the REAB Project for Voting Rights at All Souls Unitarian Church. We're a group of folks organizing around voting rights under the name of our former Associate Minister, Reverend James Reeb, who was a martyr of the voting rights struggle. He answered Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s call to go down to support the folks of Selma after Bloody Sunday, and he was murdered there by white vigilantes. And so our work today is in his honor and also in the honor of all the folks who contributed to the voting rights struggle. And we work to contribute to the national effort around voting rights, also to contribute to the local effort around DC disenfranchisement, and also in partnership with communities in North Carolina who are at ground zero of the voting rights struggle. So my question for you all today is, what is the role of civil disobedience in the struggle for voting rights today? I mean, we've learned a lot about the struggle 50 years ago and the role that civil disobedience played across the civil rights movement. And so how can folks show up today in acts of civil disobedience or otherwise acts of protest to contribute to this work?
Such as the mobilization of Black Lives Matter, is that what you're speaking about?
Yeah, which I think is, of course, broader civil disobedience around broader racial justice issues. But specifically, if you have thought specifically on the voting rights issue, what can we do? How can we show up?
Let's give that to you.
Well, I think that you don't see major progress with voting rights historically unless there's also a lot of activism and frequently major street protests. Just think about the moment when Johnson had to go before Congress and introduce the bill, and he used the phrase, "Post-Selma, we shall overcome." I think that people can't really protest visibly the denial of votes without going through the court system unless there's other activities. So Black Lives Matter gets to the aspect of that is common in voting rights success generally of young people being active. They are not active in asking for the vote yet in any specific way because they're asking for the benefits of the vote. The distance from there to focusing on the vote is the distance between finding a leadership that focuses on solutions so that we have an activist community, and that's the first step of engagement to the more discrete activity of voting.
Do we not have that leadership in place right now?
I think it may be coming. I don't see it at the national level, but that is in part because it isn't structured around the legislative proposals. For example, there's a proposal to reinstate the Voting Rights Act, but that hasn't reached across the Congress to the people, and there are people here, even people like Barbara Anqoinette, who are maybe essential elements in making that link.
Okay, thank you for your question. Somebody else. Hi, how are you?
Hello, my name is Robert Vincent Branham, and I'm a retired veteran. And as far as the civil disobedience, I went with Beverly to part of the DC 41 and the DC vote protests when Congress tried to, in fact, block the District of Columbia from using its own funds for women's health care.
Yes.
And we went down and I was one of the 41 that got arrested. Mr. Jackson, I get your emails. And not only do I not follow you, but I also follow Crystal Wright, Tara Sedmire, and Amy Holmes. And I find it difficult to believe that invisible black Republicans in the Republican Party leadership think that black Democrats would en masse go to a party that on a regular basis insults their intelligence, that somehow or another black people cannot think for themselves and are unable to advocate for their own rights with intelligence and passion, that they have to be insulted because of what they believe and what they have experienced every day. In this city, and I go all over, and I'm very active, and I don't see black Republicans out there marching or working with others in the community for routine quality of life issues.
Okay, thank you for your comment. I'm going to let Raynard have a chance to respond.
Well, I read you a quote by this Justice Department, how they insulted blacks in a legal brief. So if that didn't piss you off, I don't know what else will. I can't speak for your not seeing certain Republicans in D.C. I live in Virginia. I know tons of black folks, Republicans, all across the country who are involved, who are lifetime members of NAACP. You have people like Bob Brown. He's on the Urban League board. You got people like A.R. Bernard up in New York. So they're out there. So whether they're active in D.C., I know not. But you want to talk about insulting, black folks gave Obama 96 and 94% of their vote. And I even voted for Obama in 2008. And for him to spend all of his time dealing with homosexual issues, amnesty for illegals, and ignoring blacks. The black unemployment rate is twice that of white and half that of Hispanic. He devastates the HBCU community. He tells black folks when he spoke in front of the CBC in 2010, get out of bed, put your marching shoes on, and stop complaining. Went the next month to the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and listed off a whole list of things he's doing for them. Went to the following month to the Human Rights Campaign and listed all the things he's doing for the homosexual community. But he tells black folks to get out of bed, put your marching shoes. If that doesn't offend you coming from a black president,
can I mention?
I don't know what else will.
Kimberly?
Yeah, I just want to mention something about the partisan politics. I think what we're all struggling with here, whether it's the disenfranchisement of the people of the District of Columbia or trying to move to restore the Voting Rights Act, we've got to keep people accountable. There is guilt on both sides of the
But you
aisle.
never talk about the Democrats and Obama.
I'm talking about it right now. I'm talking about it right now. We have got to call folks out when they are not accountable to
Let me hear you call Obama out for ignoring DC statehood.
When the young woman just asked the question about more action and more civil disobedience, there needs to be more of that.
Yes.
We are seeing more of it from the grassroots because lawmakers will pay attention to money. We all know that. A whole nother show could be done on Citizens United. I won't go there. But it is there. And so civil disobedience will be the only way that our voices are heard, that we can keep people accountable, and our demands will finally be met. So there's guilt on both sides of the aisle.
And there's a link between voting rights and Black Lives Matter. I want people to know that in Waller County, Texas, where Sandra Bland was killed, we got to say her name, uplift our black women and girls who have also suffered under this, police state problems that we have in too many cities. But in Waller County, Texas, the Lawyers Committee had to sue them 3 times when I was head of the Lawyers Committee. We had to sue them for voting rights and disenfranchisement, where they were refusing to let the black students from Prairie View University vote, where they actually were proposing to take the voting precinct from the university and put it out in a white community in the vicinity of a Klan house, a known Klan house. I mean, these are the kinds of, tactics that Waller County was using when Sandra Bland was murdered. And people said, how could that happen? I said, of course it could happen. It's the same politics.
Structural racism is a real problem, and we don't talk about it enough. We don't analyze it enough. We don't even understand it. We talk about all racism as one thing, but it's very, very differentiated.
We're going to have to leave it there. But we're all very passionate about this issue, and the conversation continues. So, unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thanks to our panel, our studio audience, and you at home. But let's keep the conversation going on social media and consider being part of our studio audience during our next episode. We'd love to have you. I'm Anqoinette Crosby, and until next time, I'll save you a seat.
Great job.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.